Reed knew the captain was right. But in that moment, with German forces still pushing through the Ardennes and his unit desperately holding the line, it didn't matter. He'd found something that worked, something that was keeping him and his squad mates alive. He'd worry about tomorrow when tomorrow came. That afternoon, Morrison pulled Reed aside. The sergeant's expression was troubled. The captain's spreading the word about what you can do. He's making you official sniper for this sector, but without a scope. Says your technique doesn't work with magnified optics blocking your peripheral awareness. That's correct, Sergeant? Reed, listen to me. What you're doing, it's making the men nervous. They think it's unnatural. Some are saying you've got some kind of curse, that you're not seeing the Germans, you're sensing them like a witch or something. Reed felt his stomach tighten. He'd heard the whispers, seen the way some soldiers made signs against evil when they thought he wasn't looking. Superstition ran deep in combat zones, and men desperate for any advantage would grasp at anything that seemed to work, even if they didn't understand it. It's not magic, Sergeant. It's just paying attention. Using senses everyone has, but most people ignore. I know that. You know that. But scared soldiers looking for something to believe in, they'll turn you into a legend or a demon, depending on how tomorrow's fight goes. Just be careful, Reed. Being known is dangerous in its own way. The sergeant's words proved prophetic sooner than either expected. Over the next week, as the Battle of the Bulge raged across the Ardennes, Reed's reputation spread through the American lines like wildfire. The soldier who could kill Germans without seeing them. The ghost sniper who fired at shadows and never missed. Men from other units came to watch him work, trying to understand his technique. Some could grasp the basics, listening for specific sounds, watching for disturbances in the snowfall, but none could match Reed's success rate. You've got to teach me, Kowalski begged one frozen evening. Whatever you're doing, however you're doing it, I want to learn, Reed tried. He spent hours explaining what to listen for, how to filter out irrelevant noise, how to build a mental map of the acoustic environment. But it was like trying to teach someone to hear music in a waterfall. Most men simply couldn't process sensory information the way Reed's brain had learned to do. Maybe it's because you grew up hunting, Private Chen suggested. He was the unit's radio man, a thoughtful kid from San Francisco. Your brain developed differently, adapted to tracking prey in wilderness conditions. The rest of us city boys, we never learned to listen like that. Reed thought there might be truth to that. His childhood in Montana had been spent in vast spaces where understanding the environment meant survival. He'd tracked elk through forests, listened for the territorial calls of wolves, learned to read weather patterns in the way wind moved through pine trees. The skills hadn't seemed special at the time. They were just how you lived if you grew up in that landscape. But here, in this frozen hell, those skills had transformed into something else entirely. Something that kept him alive while other men died. The Germans were adapting too. Reed noticed it during a firefight on December 21st. The enemy soldiers were changing their tactics, moving more erratically, making less noise. They were trying to become unpredictable, to break the patterns he relied on. It was smart. If Reed couldn't anticipate their movements, his technique became less effective. But adaptation went both ways. Reed started focusing on what he couldn't consciously hear. The pressure changes in air when bodies moved through space, the subtle variations in wind patterns that indicated obstacles ahead. He began tracking multiple sounds simultaneously, building a three-dimensional acoustic map in his mind that updated in real time. It was exhausting, requiring levels of concentration that left him drained after every engagement. But it worked. The key was staying one step ahead of German counter-tactics. When they stopped making noise, he watched for visual disturbances. When they tried to mask those disturbances, he listened for their breathing. When they controlled their breathing, he tracked the tiny metallic sounds their weapons made. There was always something, some tell that gave away human presence in the forest. By Christmas Eve, Reed had killed 37 enemy soldiers, all without using his rifle's iron sights in the traditional way. He'd become something other units had started calling the Ghost. Men told stories about him around fires, embellishing his abilities, turning him into something more than human. The attention made Reed deeply uncomfortable. I'm just a soldier doing my job, he told Henderson. When the captain informed him reporter wanted to interview him for stars and stripes. "You're more than that now," Henderson replied. "Whether you like it or not, you've become a symbol. Proof that Americans can beat the Germans at their own game, even in the worst conditions imaginable. The brass wants to use your story for morale purposes. And if the Germans hear about it, if they realize there's a specific soldier using this technique, then they'll come for you. But they're already coming for all of us, Reed. At least this way, your story might give other men hope." Reed understood the logic, but it didn't make him feel better. Being anonymous was safer. Being famous made you a target. His fears were realized 4 days after Christmas. Reed was repositioning to a new sector when mortar fire bracketed his squad's movement. It was too accurate, too precisely timed. Someone had been watching their patterns, learning their habits. As Reed dove for cover, he realized the terrible truth. The Germans were hunting him specifically. They'd noticed that American casualties in his sector were significantly lower than elsewhere. They'd observed how enemy soldiers in Reed's area of operation died at statistically impossible rates, and they'd connected those facts to reports of an American marksman who fought without a scope, who seemed to know where Germans were before they revealed themselves. Now they wanted him dead. Fall back. Morrison screamed as another salvo of mortar rounds exploded around them. "They've got our range!" Reed ran, his mind racing as fast as his feet. The Germans weren't just shelling randomly. They were herding his unit toward a prepared position. This was an ambush specifically designed to kill or capture him. As he crashed through the frozen underbrush, Reed made a decision. If the Germans wanted him this badly, he could use that. He could turn their focused attention into a weapon against them. "Sergeant," he called to Morrison, "I've got an idea, but you're not going to like it." Morrison's face was pale with cold and fear. "If it keeps us alive, I'll love it." "What do you need?" "I need to draw them out, make them commit to killing me. While they're focused on me, the rest of you can flank them." "That's suicide, Reed. Not if I'm fast enough. Not if I can use what I've learned." Morrison looked like he wanted to argue, but more mortar rounds cut off any debate. "Time was running out. Do it," the sergeant finally said. "For if you die, I'm putting stupidly heroic on your grave marker." Reed managed a grim smile. Then he did something he'd never done before. He stood up in the middle of the kill zone and fired 3 shots into the air. The reaction was immediate. German rifles opened up from multiple positions, all aimed at Reed's exposed figure. But Reed was already moving, his body reacting before his conscious mind could process the incoming fire. He dropped, rolled, came up firing at the muzzle flashes he'd seen. His Garand barked 4 times and he heard 2 impacts, 2 men going down, but there were more. At least a dozen Germans in a semicircle around his position. This was a dedicated hunter-killer team, and they'd brought overwhelming force. Reed's world narrowed to pure sensation. He wasn't thinking anymore, wasn't consciously aiming. His body moved on instinct, processing the avalanche of sensory information and responding faster than thought. He heard the scrape of a rifle bolt 40 feet to his left and fired twice in that direction. He caught the glint of starlight on metal ahead and put a bullet through it. He felt the pressure wave of a near miss and dropped flat as a burst of automatic fire shredded the space where his head had been. Time stretched and compressed. Seconds became eternities. Reed was everywhere and nowhere, moving through the frozen forest like smoke, leaving dead Germans in his wake. His Garand clicked empty, and he reloaded without breaking stride, his hands operating on muscle memory, while his attention stayed focused on the symphony of death surrounding him. Then Morrison and the others hit the German flank. The ambush turned into chaos as American soldiers poured fire into the enemy position from an unexpected angle. Germans who'd been focused entirely on Reed found themselves caught in a crossfire. The engagement lasted maybe 90 seconds, though it felt like hours to Reed. When silence finally fell, he was standing in the middle of a circle of bodies, his Garand smoking in the freezing air. 9, Kowalski said, his voice full of awe as he counted the German dead around Reed's position. "You killed 9 of them by yourself while they were all shooting at you. How is that even possible?" Reed didn't answer. He was shaking, his body finally catching up to what he'd just survived. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him hollow and cold. Henderson arrived an hour later with reinforcements. He surveyed the scene with grim approval, then pulled Reed aside. "I've been ordered to pull you off the line," the captain said quietly. "They want you back at headquarters." Want to study what you can do, maybe try to train others in your techniques? No, Reed said immediately. That wasn't a request, soldier. I know, sir, but I'm refusing anyway. My unit needs me here, and what I do, it's not something you can teach in a classroom. It's something you develop by surviving day after day in this hell. Take me away from that and I lose it. Henderson studied him for a long moment. You know they'll kill you eventually. The Germans. They'll keep coming until they figure out how to counter what you do. Or until you make one mistake. Everyone dies eventually, Captain. At least this way I'm taking some of them with me. The captain sighed, looking older than his years. I'll tell headquarters you're too valuable to pull from the field right now. But Reed, listen to me. What you're doing out here, it's changing combat doctrine. After this war ends, militaries are going to study you. They're going to try to replicate your abilities. You're inventing a whole new way of fighting. I'm not inventing anything, sir. I'm just trying not to die. Maybe. But sometimes survival is the greatest innovation of all. The new year arrived with more snow and more fighting. The German offensive had stalled, but the Ardennes remained a meat grinder. Reed continued his work, killing with mechanical precision, his skills growing sharper with each engagement. He'd learned to track up to 6 targets simultaneously, to predict enemy movements 3 or 4 steps ahead, to read the forest like a living map that updated in real time. But Henderson had been right about one thing. The Germans were adapting. They'd stopped sending regular infantry against Reed's sector. Instead, they deployed their own snipers, carefully trained men who understood how to move silently, how to control their breathing, how to minimize the sounds and visual tells that Reed had learned to exploit. These were professionals, and they were hunting him with the same dedication he'd used against their comrades. The first time Reed faced one, he almost died. He was in his foxhole at dawn when he sensed something wrong. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound where sound should be. To avoid in the acoustic environment that his brain flagged as unnatural, Reed froze, every sense straining. There, 40 yards ahead, slightly uphill. Something was there, something that was trying very hard to be invisible. He raised his Garand slowly, tracking toward the disturbance. His finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, his instincts screamed a warning. This felt wrong. Too obvious, too perfect. Reed threw himself sideways just as a rifle cracked from his right. The bullet, meant for his head instead, tore through his shoulder, spinning him around and slamming him against the frozen wall of his foxhole. Pain exploded through his body, hot and immediate. The void ahead had been a decoy. The real threat had been watching from a completely different position. Reed's training took over despite the agony. He rolled, came up firing one-handed at where the muzzle flash had originated. His shots were wild, desperate, but they forced the German sniper to take cover. That gave Morrison and the others time to react, pouring suppressive fire into the enemy position. Reed's hit. Someone yelled, "Stay down!" Morrison roared, "There's more than one of them out there." The sergeant was right. Reed, fighting through waves of pain, counted at least 3 distinct firing positions. The Germans had sent a team. They'd studied his patterns, learned his techniques, and developed counters. The decoy, the flanking shot, the coordinated suppression, this was professional work. Reed pressed his back against the foxhole wall, his wounded shoulder screaming. He could feel blood soaking through his uniform. The wound wasn't immediately fatal, but he was losing effectiveness fast. Pain and blood loss would slow his reactions, dull his senses, give the German snipers the advantage they needed, unless he changed the game entirely. "Smoke," Reed called to Kowalski. "I need smoke grenades now." The private looked confused but complied, tossing 3 smoke canisters toward Reed's position. White smoke billowed across the battlefield, reducing visibility to near zero. Most soldiers would consider this a disadvantage. But Reed had spent weeks training himself to fight without relying on vision. For him, smoke was an advantage. He moved through the white fog like a predator, his Garand held ready in his good hand. The pain in his shoulder had become background noise, something he acknowledged but didn't let control him. All his attention focused on listening, on feeling the currents of air and sound that would reveal enemy positions. There. A breath, carefully controlled but not quite silent. 15 yards ahead, slightly left, Reed fired twice, heard a body fall, behind him another sound. The scrape of cloth on frozen dirt, someone trying to flank him through the smoke. Reed spun and fired again. The Garand's ping signaled an empty magazine, but he'd heard the impact. Another enemy down. The third sniper was smarter. He'd gone completely still, becoming part of the environment. Reed couldn't hear him, couldn't sense him through the normal methods. This one was good enough to understand exactly what Reed was doing and how to counter it. So Reed stopped trying to hunt him. Instead, he did something unexpected. He started talking. "You're good," Reed called out in German, his accent rough but understandable. "Better than the others. You almost got me," silence. But Reed was listening for something specific. The tiny change in breathing that came when someone was surprised. When their focus shifted from hunting to processing unexpected information. There, 20 yards to his right, behind a fallen log. "Your decoy worked perfectly," Reed continued, moving slowly through the smoke. "I should be dead right now. But you made one mistake. He was closer now. 15 yards. The smoke was starting to clear. You assumed I need to see to shoot. You assumed vision was essential to my technique. 10 yards. But I learned to hunt in Montana. Do you know what Montana winters are like? Do you know what it means to track an elk through a whiteout blizzard? 5 yards. Reed could sense the other sniper's position now, could feel the presence of another human being occupying space in the environment. It means learning to see without eyes. Reed fired his last 3 rounds through the thinning smoke. The German sniper, finally panicking, broke cover to return fire. But his shots went wide, his composure shattered by the psychological warfare Reed had waged. Morrison and the others finished it, their rifles cutting down the enemy sniper as he exposed himself. When the smoke cleared completely, Reed was still standing, his shoulder wound seeping blood, his face pale with shock and pain, but he was alive. And 3 of Germany's best snipers were dead at his feet. The medics evacuated Reed to a field hospital, where doctors patched his shoulder and told him he'd be out of action for at least 3 weeks. Henderson visited him there, bringing news from the front. The German offensive collapsed completely. "We're pushing them back now, taking ground they held for weeks. Your sector held when others fell, Reed. That made a difference. Any soldier in my position would have done the same, sir." "No," Henderson said firmly. "They really wouldn't have. What you did out there, what you developed under pressure, that's something special. The Army is talking about creating specialized training programs based on your techniques. Acoustic tracking, sensory integration, predictive shooting. You've created a whole new doctrine." Reed closed his eyes, suddenly exhausted. "I just wanted to go home alive, Captain." "I know. But sometimes what we want and what we accomplish are different things." After Henderson left, Reed lay in the hospital bed and thought about Montana, about mountains and forests that existed without war, about hunting as something done for food rather than survival, about sounds that meant life instead of death. He wondered if he'd ever be able to go back to that, whether his brain, rewired by months of combat, could ever return to normal, whether the skills that had kept him alive would haunt him forever, making peacetime feel dangerous and unpredictable. But those were questions for tomorrow. For now he was alive, his shoulder would heal, and somewhere in the frozen Ardennes, American soldiers were holding the line because of the techniques he'd pioneered. It would have to be enough. 3 weeks later, Reed returned to his unit. His shoulder was stiff but functional, and his hearing was as sharp as ever. The Battle of the Bulge was over, the German offensive broken. But the war continued, and men were still dying in the forests and towns of Europe. Reed picked up his Garand, settled into a new foxhole, and listened to the symphony of combat around him. The sounds were different now. The Germans were in retreat, fighting defensive actions rather than offensive pushes. But the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Out there in the trees and snow, enemies still needed to be found and killed. And Reed had become very, very good at finding them. Kowalski approached him that first night back, looking nervous. "They're saying you're immortal now, that you came back from the dead," Reed snorted. "I got shot and spent 3 weeks in a hospital bed. Nothing immortal about that. Still, the men, they believe in you. They think having you here means they'll survive. That's dangerous thinking, Kowalski. I'm just one soldier. I can't protect everyone. Maybe not, but you've given us something to believe in. Something that says we're not helpless against this, that we can learn, adapt, become better. That's worth something. Even if it's not immortality." Reed didn't have a response to that, so he just nodded. and turned his attention back to the forest, listening for the patterns that meant danger, the sounds that meant life or death. The next 4 months passed in a blur of combat as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. Reed continued his work, training others when he could, fighting when he had to. His techniques spread through American lines with varying degrees of success. Most soldiers could grasp the basics, listening carefully, watching for disturbances, firing predictively, but few could match Reed's integration of all these skills into a cohesive system. That was fine. Reed had never wanted to be special. He just wanted to survive. By April 1945, the war was clearly ending. German forces were collapsing on all fronts, and rumors of surrender filled the air. Reed's unit had advanced to a small village in southern Germany when Henderson found him one last time. "It's over, Reed. Word came down an hour ago." Germany surrendered. "The war in Europe is done." Reed set down his rifle, the weapon suddenly feeling heavier than ever. "Over," he repeated, testing the word. It felt strange on his tongue. "You did it, son. You survived. We all survived, sir. Those of us who made it this far." "True, but you did more than survive. You changed how we fight. Military intelligence has been documenting your techniques for months. After we go home, they'll be teaching what you invented to new soldiers. Your legacy will be every American who learns to fight the way you learned to fight." Reed thought about that, about young soldiers being taught to hear the forest, to sense enemies through sound and sensation, to fire before seeing their targets. Part of him was proud. Another part felt deeply uneasy. "Sir, I hope they teach them something else too." What's that? That all these techniques, all these skills, they're only necessary because of war. And war is something we should be trying to prevent, not perfect. Henderson smiled sadly. "Wise words, Reed. I hope someone listens to them." The next week, Reed boarded a ship headed for America. As the European coast disappeared behind him, he stood at the rail and thought about everything he'd learned in the frozen forests of Belgium and Germany. He'd gone to war as a simple marksman from Montana and emerged as something else entirely. A soldier who'd pushed the boundaries of human perception, who developed techniques that would influence military doctrine for decades. Men would study him, write about him, try to replicate what he'd done. But Reed knew the truth that those future soldiers wouldn't understand from reading reports or watching training films. The technique he developed wasn't just about superior hearing or faster reactions. It was about desperation, about the human mind's ability to adapt when adaptation meant survival, about pushing past normal limitations because the alternative was death. You couldn't teach that in a classroom. You couldn't train it on a range. It was something that emerged from the crucible of combat itself, from the terrible necessity of killing or being killed. As Montana's mountains finally appeared on the horizon weeks later, Reed made himself a promise. He would talk to researchers and trainers if they asked. He would explain his techniques as best he could. But he would also tell them this: the greatest victory wasn't learning to kill without seeing. It was living in a world where such skills were no longer necessary. Reed returned home to Montana in early June 1945. His father met him at the train station, and they drove home in comfortable silence through familiar mountains. The world looked different now, felt different. Colors seemed sharper, sounds more distinct. Reed's combat-honed senses made everything feel hyper-real and slightly threatening. It would take time to adjust. That evening, sitting on the porch of his family's cabin, Reed's father finally spoke. "You're different, son. I can see it in how you hold yourself, how you listen to the forest. I learned some things overseas, Dad, things I wish I hadn't needed to learn. Your mother and I heard stories about a soldier who could shoot in the dark, who could hear Germans coming before anyone else could. Was that you?" Reed nodded slowly. "That's remarkable, Thomas. You should be proud." "I am, and I'm not. It's complicated." His father didn't push. They sat together watching the sun set over the peaks. And for the first time in 18 months, Reed felt the beginnings of peace. Years later, military historians would study Thomas Reed's combat record and techniques. They'd write papers analyzing his methods, create training programs attempting to replicate his success. Some of those programs would work. Many wouldn't, because what Reed had done wasn't just technical, it was personal. A unique combination of background, ability, and desperate necessity that couldn't be fully replicated. But Reed had succeeded in one crucial way. He'd proven that human adaptability could exceed what anyone thought possible. That under pressure, with lives on the line, soldiers could push past normal limitations and achieve things that seemed impossible. He'd also proven that survival itself could be a form of innovation. The men who served with Thomas Reed never forgot him. They told their children and grandchildren about the ghost sniper who fought without a scope, who heard enemies before they appeared, who'd helped hold the line during the darkest winter of the war. Some of those stories were accurate, many were embellished. All of them carried a core of truth. There had been a young soldier from Montana who'd learned to see without eyes, to kill without aiming, to survive when survival seemed impossible. And in doing so, he'd changed warfare forever. But more importantly, he'd come home. He'd survived the frozen hell of the Ardennes and returned to the mountains he loved. And perhaps that was the greatest achievement of all. Reed lived for many more decades, hunting in the same forests where his father had taught him to listen to the world. He rarely spoke about the war, and when he did, it was always with a mixture of pride and sadness. He'd done what needed doing, but he'd never forgotten the cost. On quiet winter nights, when snow fell heavy and thick like it had in Belgium all those years ago, Reed would sometimes stand at his window and listen. Not for enemies now, just listening to remember what it had felt like to be so perfectly attuned to the world around him, so focused on survival that every sense operated at peak capacity. Those moments never lasted long. The peace of Montana wasn't the terror of the Ardennes, but the memories remained, preserved like insects in amber, forever frozen, forever present. And sometimes in those moments of remembering, Thomas Reed allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. He'd survived the impossible. He'd invented new ways to fight and helped his fellow soldiers come home alive. And when the war ended, he'd managed to return to the life he'd left behind. Not everyone could say the same. So Reed counted himself lucky. Even though luck had nothing to do with it, he'd simply learned to listen. And in listening, he'd learned to survive. That was the real legacy of the soldier they'd called the ghost sniper. Not the kills or the techniques or the tactical innovations, but the simple, profound truth that human beings could adapt to anything if the stakes were high enough. And sometimes, that adaptation could look like magic. Even when it was really just a young man from Montana, doing whatever it took to see home again.